All right, welcome to macroeconomics. This is our first online lecture, and we're going to talk about some basic concepts, some review of old material. Now, before going through the lecture material, I want to give you a few instructions. Here's how these videos work. These are really the same as our lecture material. So it's just like being in a class and getting the lecture. So this is the course content, and it is part of your learning process. So what happens is that every week you're gonna watch a video, and you have to take notes on that, just like a regular class. The advantage of the video is that it's a little bit more interactive. There are questions in the videos to test your knowledge, to make sure you're understanding, and you have more freedom. You can watch it, over the weekend, for instance, or at night, and you can rewind. You can watch it over again if you have any problem. But that's the idea. And then the next class you come in for basically some activities, some practice. So you are gonna get handouts. Sometimes we have quizzes, and most of the time these are done in teams. So you're gonna get some practice in the class, and it's important to be prepared for those practice. And the way you prepare is to follow these online lessons. So after each lesson, there's going to be a set of questions that you answer online, and sometimes you have to bring them to class. Here's the simple rule for taking notes. Anything that's written on the screen, you have to copy it down in your notebooks. All right, so whatever is written on the screen, you write it down in your notebooks. You can paraphrase if you want. You can use your own words. That's fine. But you have to understand all of the concepts. And also, when I explain something, if you notice that I'm emphasizing something or I'm repeating something, you would want to write that down also. So you have to kind of listen carefully to the audio also. It's usually common student mistakes that I tend to emphasize. All right. I'm going to give you marks for your notes. So toward the end of the course, I'll ask you to bring me your notebooks to show them to me, just to impress me, all the nice notes that you take. All right. So here we're going to do a little review of Intro to Economics. If anything does not make sense by the end of this lesson, then you would want to refer back to your intro notes. Another useful tip is, as you take notes, write down this slide number on the top left corner. This is going to be useful for your future reference. So let's begin. The most basic and fundamental central concept in macroeconomics is the GDP, gross domestic product. And if you remember, the definition of GDP is the total value of all goods and services produced in a country during a given period of time. So usually that's a year. So GDP is the same as total output. If you see total output anywhere, it's the same as GDP. The question here is, how should we measure GDP? All right, so we have to come up with something practical, a way of measuring GDP. And there are two main ways of doing that. One of them is count the total spending. All of the dollars that are spent on Canadian goods and services, we count them up, and that's going to be our GDP. The other measure for GDP is total income. All of the income that people make on making those goods and services is going to be our GDP. So total output is the same as total spending, and it's the same as total income, and total income is the same as total spending. So there is a triangle that we have. Let me just explain why we have this kind of equality or identity. It's quite intuitive, actually. Think of this. Think of a restaurant. In a restaurant, you have the chef, you have the waiter, you have the owner. Where does the income of these people come from? It comes from people who go and dine there, right? So if you think of it, some people go and spend money in the restaurant. Whatever they spend becomes the income of someone else, which is the owner and the chef and the waiter, right? That's why total spending equals total income, right? Think of a retailer. Where does the income of the retailer come from? Well, people who spend money there, right? So this is kind of like the circular flow diagram. People spend somewhere, it becomes the income of someone else. Total spending is also called aggregate expenditure, AE. So aggregate means total, expenditure means spending. We're going to use that word a lot, so make sure you understand what it means. It's simple. Total income is also called national income, and the symbol for that is Y. It's not a smart symbol, but we're going to use all of these things interchangeably. So national income, if you see that, it's the same as GDP. Y, if you see that, is the symbol for GDP. All right, so you want to pause here, write this slide number, and then write down the note and this small nice diagram. For the purpose of this course, we're going to focus on the expenditure approach to GDP. So we are going to classify some sectors and their different types of expenditure in order to make our analysis later easier, right? So here's the thing. Think of all forms of spending that take place. What is it that you guys buy, right? Think of, I don't know, food, drink, school material, paying for your cell phones, transportation, right? Anything that we typically buy can be classified as consumption, right? So the sector involved is households. Households means everyone, pretty much, all the population, in the sense that they are consumers, right? All goods and services purchased by consumers. Now, other than households, who else is there in a country, in an economy, that buys things? If you remember your circular flow diagram, we had the other side, which were the producers or firms, and they also spend money, right? So whatever the firms spend is called investment, right? Investment is a little bit tricky. You might want to be careful here. In economics, whenever we say investment, we are talking about the firm's spending. We are not talking about stock investment. That's not in economics. Economic investment is firms spending money on goods and services. Who else is there other than households and firms? Yeah, the big guys, the government, right? So the spending by the government is called government purchases. And other than all of these are within the country, so we also have sometimes foreigners who spend money on our goods and services. And whatever we sell to them is called exports. All right, so you want to pause here and write these down. I think it's a good idea to do a little bit of drawing for yourself. It helps retain the material. You don't have, you can do your own drawings of these things, but it helps. All right, so write down the slide number and take down your notes. Continuing from the last slide, what we have is we can have this formula for GDP, which is the same as aggregate expenditure, total spending, and that is C, consumption, plus I, investment, plus G, government purchases, plus X, exports, right? Now, we had this D in the GDP, which stands for domestic, gross domestic product, which means that we are trying to find the value of all goods and services produced inside Canada. We are looking at Canadian goods and services. Here's a question. Think of the things that you buy. Are they all made in Canada? Probably not. You know, a simple example is coffee. We don't grow coffee here. It doesn't grow in this kind of climate. So we import a lot of things. The companies, when they buy machinery, when they buy, I don't know, trucks, a lot of times those things are not produced in Canada. They're imported. The government, if they buy, I don't know, consultation from some other company in another country, or if they buy something for the military, we don't have such advanced military equipment. So a lot of times these things are imported. If you include those in GDP, you are double counting. You're overestimating GDP because you're including foreign products, right? So the idea is that we are going to subtract imports so that we adjust for goods and services produced abroad but purchased by Canadian households, firms, and governments, right? So this, by the way, is goods and services. I have these abbreviations sometimes, but I read it out for you, so you can write it out if you don't like these. So we have to, so the subtraction of imports is just an adjustment, all right? This imports, the symbol for it is IM in the book. It's also used as M sometimes, right? But we're gonna use IM. You might have seen M before, it's the same thing anyway. So this is a very useful formula. Highlight it or underline it because you're gonna need it a lot. Another important concept that you must have seen before is the difference between nominal and real GDP. So nominal GDP is basically GDP valued at current prices. It tells us about the money value of output. Basically, the idea is that we are using the dollars or the prices of the same year. So if you talk about the GDP of 2018, we are using the prices of 2018 and so forth. Real GDP is GDP valued at base year prices. It tells us about the quantity of output, not necessarily the actual dollar value, but the quantity. That's why it's called real. So here's a simple image. If you're talking about the actual stuff that you buy, that would be real GDP. If you talk about the dollar value of that, that would be nominal. So where does it become important is when you talk about the changes in GDP. The changes in nominal GDP reflect the combined effects of changes in quantity and price, both. There are two elements in nominal GDP, whereas in real GDP there's only one thing. It reflects only the effect of changes in the quantity, right? And in economics, we care about real GDP, all right? This is what we focus on because we are not really interested in just the dollar value going up, but we are interested in the actual production, right? If you are really making more goods and services. So pause here and write down your notes. So whenever we have nominal and real GDP, it really refers to the price level and inflation. So what is the price level? Price level is the average level of all prices in the economy. Remember, in macroeconomics, we are talking about everything, not just one item. It's not about the price of cars or the price of food or the price of education. It's about the price of all goods and services. So we have to kind of combine everything. It's an index number, which means a relative measure of a variable compared to some specified time. And that specified time is the base year, right? So base year is really an arbitrary year. You can set any year as the base year, but the important thing is just to keep it there and be consistent with it, all right? So we have two main price levels that we use in macroeconomics. One of them is called the GDP deflator, which is the average price of all goods and services produced in Canada. And the other one is the CPI, Consumer Price Index, which is the average price of all goods and services consumed in Canada. So one of them focuses more on the production side, one of them focuses more on the consumption side. Now this index, numbered index, what is index? Well, index is kind of like a point of reference, right? And a simple and useful tip here is that any index value in the base year is 100. So whatever you set as your base year, the index value of that, the price level of that is going to be 100. All right, this is quite useful, so you might want to take note of that. Inflation, it's a sustained increase in the average level of prices. So when pretty much all prices go up. And the formula for that is it's P2 minus P1 over P1 times 100. So 2 and 1, you could think of it as second year and first year. So the price today minus price last year over the price last year times 100. All right, so that's when the cost of living goes up. This formula that you see is the percent change formula. It shows us the growth rate of the price level. All right, it's a very useful formula. It's has a generic form. In this case, it's the growth rate of P, and P is the price level. All right, and the two types of price level are GDP deflator or CPI. Okay, so pause, write down. We use two main price levels to measure inflation. One of them is called the GDP deflator, which is a measure for the change of average prices. And the formula for that is nominal GDP over real GDP times 100. All right. The other one is Consumer Price Index, the CPI, which is a weighted average of the price of a basket of over 600 consumer goods and services. This is not a real basket. This is an imaginary basket, including the goods and services that are commonly bought by households. All right. So the formula for the CPI would be the cost of the basket today, or the cost of the basket in the base year, times 100. So we have a fixed basket. Go find the cost of it this year. Compare it to the same basket valued last year, or whatever is your base year. All right. So write down these formulas. A very important and cool concept that we talk about when we talk about inflation is purchasing power. And that is the amount of goods and services you can buy with your dollar. It's also called the value of money and real income. Okay, so value of money not in terms of currency exchange, but the ability of your dollar to buy goods and services for you. It has a simple formula. Purchasing power is income divided by the price level. So we are not talking about the actual dollar value that you may have in your hands, but the actual dollar value compared to the prices in the society. So if the prices go up, which means inflation, your purchasing power goes down. All right, that's also called buying power. So it's the ability of your money to acquire things for you. Something relevant also is the interest rate, which is what borrowers have to pay and what savers or lenders receive. So whenever we talk about interest rate, you must think about these two sides in the economy, the borrowers and the savers. Both of them are affected in opposite ways though. All right. Now, the real interest rate is the interest rate adjusted for inflation. Remember, real means excluding inflation. It's the change in your purchasing power. So it has a simple formula. Real interest rate equals nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. The rate that they give you at the bank, for instance, that's the nominal interest rate. Okay, if there's a lot of inflation going on, maybe that's not a good idea because you are losing purchasing power. So even if the nominal interest rate is relatively high, you must also look at the inflation rate. Okay, so it could be that your money loses value, which means a negative real interest rate. Whenever we talk about interest rate, you must think about these two sides. You must think about the borrower's incentive to borrow and the saver's incentive to save. This idea of the incentive to borrow and the incentive to save is quite important. So here's the thing. If the interest rate is very high, the borrowers don't like it because they have to pay. The savers like it because they receive, right? So they have the opposite kinds of incentive. So pause here and write down your notes. Whenever you hear this word foreign exchange, it's the same as foreign currency, right? And it could be currency of any other country in comparison. So these things, I'm going to tell you what they are. You might have seen them before. They use three letters for representing the different currencies. So CAD is the Canadian dollar, USD is US dollar, euros, Great Britain pound, Japanese yen, and Chinese yuan, right? So these are all called foreign exchange. The exchange rate, which has the symbol small e, is how much domestic currency is required to purchase 1 unit of foreign currency. How many Canadian dollars should you pay to get 1 US dollar? Or to get 1 euro, and so forth. It's the price of foreign exchange. This is a little bit tricky. Exchange rate is the price of foreign exchange, not the price of Canadian dollar. Okay, it's the price of the other currency, whatever the other is. We have this thing called the foreign exchange market, which is the market in which different national currencies are traded. All right. The word market, we use it all the time in economics. It simply means the interaction of buyers and sellers. It's a process. It's that activity, that mechanism where buyers and sellers get to exchange goods or service, or in this case, a currency. So that process of exchange is called a market. All right. So it's not really a physical location necessarily. By the way, whenever we use this word buyers, buyers is the same as demand. You might want to write that down. Sellers is the same as supply. If you are told that something depreciates, a currency depreciates, it means it's losing value. It's losing purchasing power. So it takes more units of it to buy a foreign currency. The opposite of that is appreciation, is when a currency gains value, so it takes less units of it to buy a foreign currency. All right. So one thing to note here is that exchange rates are always relative. Okay, which means you always have two sides. We must compare two sides. So in this stupid cartoon, you have the yen compared to the dollar. So if the yen, for instance, appreciates, it means the dollar depreciates, and vice versa. All right. So if one of them, it's always comparative, right? So if one of them goes up, the other one goes down. So pause here and write down your notes. One main branch of macroeconomics is called the business cycle, and that's really the fluctuations of national income, and national income is the same as GDP. All right, so this is about the economy in the short run. So whenever we talk about the business cycle, we must talk about this thing called the potential GDP, which is Y star. It's the total output that a country can produce if its resources are employed at their normal levels of utilization. It's a benchmark for assessing current production, and it's a fixed level given a constant level of resources and technology. So potential GDP, think of it as something ideal, something theoretical. It is something that we can produce. It's an important concept here. It's not what we are actually producing, it's our potential. We could produce it if we were to use all of our resources, right? Given the level of technology that we have. All right, so those two things are taken to be kind of fixed for each level of potential GDP. For this reason, if you were to graph it, which you are going to graph it, you will have to draw a vertical line. Okay, you draw a vertical line showing that this is our potential. Okay, it's our ideal. The other kind of GDP is actual GDP, which is how much the economy is actually producing now. Not how much we could produce, but how much we are producing. And we have this simple formula of an output gap, which is actual output minus potential output. So the difference that we have compared to our potential, how far are we away from our potential? That's the gap. And you can use these symbols, y minus y star. So y, sometimes it's used as y1 or y2. That's our actual, and y star is our potential. So if our actual is less than our potential, we call that a recessionary gap. So whenever you see this word recessionary gap, it simply means that the actual GDP is less than the potential. And that would be a negative output gap because our y is less than our y star. So you do the math, you're going to see you get a negative number. And the main problem that exists during a recessionary gap is unemployment, because resources are not being utilized. The opposite case, hypothetically, if the actual is more than potential, that's called an inflationary gap, and that's where we have a positive output gap. That's where our actual production is more than our potential. And the main problem there is inflation. Now you might be like, hang on, how could you have the actual more than potential? The potential is kind of like our limits. How could you ever go beyond your limits? Now if you go back to the definition of potential GDP, you see this word normal, right? Normal level of utilization. So for instance, what is the normal level of labor? What is the average work week? 40 hours a week, right? Could you work more than 40 hours a week? Yes. What is it called? Overtime? Yeah, so it's possible to make more than, if you overuse, basically, if you overuse your resources. Now, what is this normal level? A lot of times it might be arbitrary, but there is some level as long as you set it. A recession is defined as 2 consecutive quarters in which real GDP falls. What's a quarter? Quarter means 1/4, right? So 1/4 of a year is 3 months. So 2 quarters would be 6 months, right? So if real GDP falls for 6 months, then we call that a recession. All right? Just to remind you, this GDP is the same as total output and the same as national income. These terms are interchangeable. If you don't like one of them, just use the other one. All right, but you are gonna see all of them. So whenever you see one of these things, it's really the same thing. All right, so pause here and write down your notes. Something that you've seen before is this idea of the production possibilities boundary or curve, and sometimes it's also called production possibilities frontier. So PPB, PPC, and PPF, they're all the same thing. And the shape of it looks like that usually, right? So that's based on increasing opportunity cost. I have goods and services as generic titles there. You could have any kind of two products on the two axes, all right? So that's your PPB or PPC. That's a graph showing all combinations of goods and services that can be produced given all resources are fully employed and a constant level of technology. All right, so if you look at the points on the curve, what you get are these points A to F. These points show when all resources are fully employed. So if you're told to draw full employment, you could show a picture like this and refer to the points on the line. This is efficient. This is maximum possible production. If you look at a point like G out there, points above and beyond the PPC or PPB are impossible. If you look at a point like H inside, these points are possible, but some resources are idle. So idle means not working, not being used, sitting around, not doing anything. And that could be either of two things, either unemployment of resources, so you're not using your resources, or inefficient use of resources. So you are using our resources, but not in the best and most productive way. All right, as opposed to efficient. Efficient means that you're not wasting anything. So this should sound familiar. Write this down and draw a diagram for yourself. Sometimes what happens is that the PPC or PPB grows, and that's called economic growth. That's an increase in the economy's production capacity. That's really the same as having more potential. So potential GDP is really the same as the PPB or PPC. So that's when we can produce more goods and services. So the point G, which was not achievable before, becomes achievable, right? So that is a result of having more resources or better resources or better technology. So your new PPB is going to shift outward and you draw a new curve, and in this case it includes point G, so it's possible to achieve point G. So more resources refers to the quantity or amount of resources like labor and land and capital. Better resources is about the quality or productivity of resources, like more skilled labor force. And better technology is about the knowledge of how to make use of our resources, like engineering, management, scientific formulas, and new designs. Write these down.